Behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace lies a world rarely seen. Beyond ceremony and spectacle, corridors carry whispers of power, duty, and private lives lived in public view. From wartime decisions to quiet family moments, these walls have witnessed history as it unfolded.
My name is Grant Harold, aka the Royal Butler, and I was a Royal Butler to members of the British Royal Family, including the Prince of Wales, Duchess of Cornwall, and Prince William and Harry. I wanted to become a Royal Butler because I watched a documentary back in 1992 about the Queen and her family, and I liked the idea of being part of this. And I said to my late father, how do you become part of that? How do you join the Royal Family? At which point he said, well, you either marry a member of the Royal Family or you will go and work for them. And I decided that the best option would be to marry one of them. So that's how this crazy kind of dream began.
My name is Ken Wharf, formerly the protection officer bodyguard to the late Diana, Princess of Wales, and also to the young princes William and Harry. Yeah, I mean, I began my career in the police service in 1967, and it was during my time in North London in the early 80s that at the time of Margaret Thatcher's government, the mining dispute, I mean, policing was quite difficult, and although I had not fallen out of love with policing, I was becoming more and more disillusioned with the stars of policing. And rather fortuitously that I had a contact with the Queen's police officer at that time, and he suggested to me that I might be interested in a post that was coming up in royalty protection to look after the young princes William and Harry. And that's where the royalty protection journey began.
I always get asked what a Royal Butler does, and it's quite difficult to explain because the role is so varied. And the easiest way to explain it is if you've ever seen any of these kind of historical dramas and you see the butlers doing their day-to-day activities, it's kind of like that. So it's looking after, obviously, the royal family, it's looking after guests, it's laying tables, serving meals. But there's also a modern aspect, which is being able to use computers, send emails, correspondence, phone calls. The easiest way to describe a royal butler is it's almost like a personal assistant. Really, that's what you become.
For anyone that's meeting royalty for the first time, it's can be quite difficult. I mean, I wouldn't say overbearing, but I mean it was a privilege certainly and an honour, but quite nerve-breaking at the same time. I was shown into this room at Sandringham House by a very over-attentive butler, and as I walked into this room, there was Diana sat on a sofa. William, aged 5, was attempting to play a piano, let's put it like that. And Harry, aged 3, was stood on a small coffee table, and at which point he falls off this table, and the vase of flowers falls off this table. And I'm thinking, God, what's happening here? At which point Diana says, come here, both of you. And they get off and run out, pursued by their mother. And I haven't said a thing. And literally minutes later, Diana reappears and says, look, I'm so sorry about that. This is what I'm saying. I mean, I don't envy you looking after my children. But that was actually quite an interesting break of the ice, because that set the scene really to what, Diana was like. The normality of this situation was something that was so far out of my mind. I didn't think for one moment something like this would happen within a royal palace.
When I went to join the royal household, one of the things that was said was I would have to almost retrain, have to relearn the job as a royal butler. But the nice part was they knew that I was fully trained, so that I was able to kind of immediately take on good responsibility. They knew that I could do the part of a butler, but I just had to learn basically how to be a butler for members of the family that I was working for, because obviously, like everybody, you've got things that you like done a certain way, and that was kind of what I had to relearn.
I first met the Prince of Wales in Highgrove, which is their country house down in Gloucestershire. And I will say that from day one when I first met him, you know, he was incredibly professional and very generous with, you know, his hospitality, certainly for us. But I remember once William telling me in Highgrove once that he said, "Oh, Mummy wants to go out in half an hour, and she wants to go out at 9:30. And I said, "William, it's not out. It's out. It's not 8. And he said, "No, we've got to come back into the house." And I said, "What is all this house business and this out business?" And he said, "Oh, it's what Papa says." And I said, "Well, I don't think it's right. I think, you know, we're going out and we're coming back to the house." Anyway, we did go out. We did come back to the house. And then I remember a week later, I was down there and I was actually in the kitchen having breakfast, and the Prince walked in. So I gather that you've been giving William some elocution, because I knew exactly what he was talking about. And I said, well, I just explained to him so about going out and in the house, and house, you know, the pronunciation of the word out and house, and digging myself deeper into this hole. And he sort of looked at me with this sort of perpetual grimace that was getting wider across the face, and I knew what was coming. It wasn't really pleasant. And he had this remarkable way of actually telling you off without actually being rude. And he just looked at me and he went, "Oh, really?" Which was good enough for me.
The daily routine working for the King and Queen Consort was, again, it's kind of similar to any kind of butler job. You're there to kind of look after them and their guests. So everything from, obviously, from the breakfast to the lunches to the dinners, laying up the meals, serving the meals, running errands, going out and getting things, bringing things in, whether it be things for them, whether it be things for the household, dealing with day-to-day correspondence that might come in directly for them.
Yeah, for the first 6 months, I mean, I literally, you know, was, you know, looking after 2 young children. But Diana had this idea that she wanted everybody within the household to be part of this family. So, in essence, we were all, you know, part of this wider family. You know, the chefs, the dressers, the chauffeurs, you know, the housekeeper, the gardener, whoever else came in. We were all part of this gathering. I don't think it suited the Prince of Wales that much. I mean, he was very traditionally royal, and you know, it was a sort of very much an upstairs, downstairs arrangement with him. With Diana, it was different. You know, she wanted William and Harry to sort of move around the house and talk to the housekeeper, and insistent that they refer to them by their first names.
They could ask within reason for most things that you would ask a butler to do, you know, even just going and getting drinks and things. So the day was always varied. And the other thing I used to do was I became a very good housekeeper. I worked at the housekeeping department. I've got a love of being tidy, and it was something I used to pride myself upon as well, was being able to do that. And I also did valeting, which is where you look after the clothes of members of the royal family. And I loved that. I have it sounds strange, but I have a love for ironing. So I used to enjoy putting on some music and just standing and kind of ironing away. And I prided myself on that, because once again, when they were out and about, you see them wearing the things that I'd helped kind of get ready. You always felt quite proud of that.
It was quite a jolly place to be honest. It was so different from other royal households. And I remember William's first day at school, which was really quite funny. William's in the back of the car with his mother. And, you know, she said, "Now listen, William, when we get to the school, there's going to be a lot of photographers there, and I don't want you mucking about." And he sort of put his head down beneath the peak of his cap and said, "I don't like photographers." He couldn't say photographers.
Etiquette was originally founded in France by Louis XIV. He had it for his palace in Versailles. He wanted a rule book, if you like, and this stemmed from the gardens, because people were walking on the grass, and his gardener asked if they could put signs up instructing people where to walk and where not to walk. And this is how it began, and then those rules carried on within the royal court and have obviously evolved, and our royal family picked up on these centuries ago, and they've continued, they've evolved, they've changed, but they're there. And it's everything from how a member of the royal family meets and greets somebody, to how they eat, how they drink, how they carry out some daily activities, right down to how people are supposed to act and behave around them as well. So it's really important, the etiquette part, and it's something that, again, the royal family pride themselves upon.
Diana was a good mother. You know, there was a bank of nannies. There were about 3 nannies that did a shift system, that did all the sort of basic stuff, like giving them breakfast. But Diana was actually quite hands-on. Certainly, if she was in London, she would take them to school, and she would always try to be there at the end of the day, to be part of this sort of, you know, mother image, which she was very keen on doing. And yeah, they had a very good relationship, but you know, they were no different, the children, although with all the luxury and the privileges of being royal, and the, you know, a nursery that, you know, could, you know, where 4 or 5 families could live in normal circumstances. You know, they were constantly being reminded of how privileged they were and what life was like on the other side of royalty. And that's why, you know, Diana would, in a bit later, you know, took William to these refuge shelters. Again, not for any sort of photographic opportunity, because very often when we went there, we went without anyone knowing that we were going. But it was part of Diana's education, so she was very keen to be a hands-on mother in that sense, both in the house and outside of it. And, you know, I think that, you know, when you look at William and Harry today, you know, they're certainly more normal than perhaps, you know, their father was at that age. I think that, on the whole, was attributable to Diana's motherhood, quite frankly.
When it comes to etiquette, or etiquette rules that are maybe not that known when it comes to the royal family, there is a few. One of the classic kind of things is that when you meet a member of the royal family, you shouldn't offer your hand. They have to offer theirs first, and a lot of people don't realise that. It's the same with eye contact. At one time, you could never look a royal in the eyes, where these days, you can look at a royal in the eyes. At one time, you had to walk backwards when you left the presence of a royal. In some situations, you still do that, but more often, you don't. So the rules, the more unusual rules have kind of disappeared, but the handshake etiquette rule is still one that it's not strictly followed. You're not going to be told off if you forget to do it, but strictly speaking, you should let the royal offer their hand first. And one other tradition, it still carries on to this very day, I assume it's going to carry on with the king, was that the late Queen, when you had an audience with her, especially if it was if you were receiving an award, an investiture or something, when you were leaving her presence after receiving it, she would offer her hand, she would take your hand, she would give you a very gentle nudge backwards to say that your time is up.
I know there was one occasion when I just returned from my aunt in Dorset, and I always used to go and walk on Studland Bay Beach, which is a part of the National Trust, I think it is now. It was then, but a massive 3.5, 4 miles of, you know, white sand just off around Poole Harbour. And she said, well, I'd love to do that, but you know, I can't. Well, I said, you never asked. She said, well, let's do it then. And I said, okay, well, let's do it. Well, when are we going to do it? You know, because otherwise, if we don't do it now, you'll say, well, you said that, we never do it, usually. And she said, well, we could do it Thursday. I said, okay. I never told anybody. We took, I remember it was a Ford Mondeo. We drove out of her garage, and we drove down to Poole Harbour, got on the chain ferry across Poole Harbour to Studland Bay. So I dropped her off at the, just across from the ferry, and I said, look, here's the radio. If you need me, just press it and I'll come running, or whatever it was. But there was a risk element here, of course there was, but you know, there is in life anyway, and you know, nothing can be so pre-planned that's perfect. I mean, I knew that from day one I took this job on, and I much rather work in those sort of parameters of risk, actually. It's quite exciting. But anyway, Diana walked off. I drove up to the Banks Arms car park and sat on the beach. And Anyway, about half an hour later, my radio crackles into life, and it's Diana. I said, "Are you okay?" And she was laughing. And I said, "Well, you sound as though you're having a good time," which is great. She said, "Yes." She said, "But you never told me about the nudist beach." And I didn't remember it. And she'd stumbled across, you know, a half a dozen septuagenarian males, you know, walking in and out of this beautiful sea at Studland Bay. And they hadn't got a clue that the woman with the Michael Jackson jacket was actually the Princess of Wales.
State banquets are very different to, the planning's very different to a traditional royal meal, if you like, and that's because they're planned months in advance. In fact, when the invitation is issued to the other country, there's two a year traditionally, and the planning goes on months before, but the actual layup and everything on the actual table takes place a few days before. And there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, you've got the George IV Grand Service, which gets put out for decoration. It's also you'll see the gilt cutlery and the chargers, the glassware. You know, we're talking about over 2,000 pieces of crockery. So there's a huge amount of work that goes into it, and all that's got to be cleaned and polished. The napkins got to be folded. We're talking about 150 for these events. So even though if you look at a layup of a state banquet, it's very similar to how a table would be laid up for a member of the royal family. The difference is it is the finest. They're putting on a show for the foreign visiting head of state, so it's important that they have it's like we all do in our homes. When someone comes round, you put your best cutlery and crockery and glassware in.
Well, planning a royal event, an overseas visit, it takes a lot of planning. Of course it does. And there's always a reconnaissance. Pakistan, as an example. This was a major solo visit by Diana. And so there would initially be a liaison with the Pakistan embassy in London to sort out visas and stuff like that. And then we'd contact the embassy or the High Commission in Islamabad. So we'd go to Islamabad with the private secretary. We'd see the chief of police. We'd speak to local dignitaries to formulate a plan, a structure, and then that we would come back, work out what police involvements we needed, what security. We'd get checks from Central Security, MI5, MI6, to find out if there's a reason why we shouldn't go to Pakistan. Then I decide on what the manpower should be, what assistance we can get locally, where we're going to stay. In this particular case, we'd stay in the High Commission, and that was a safe compound, as you would imagine.
If you're invited to a state banquet, there's a couple of rules you have to remember and you've got to follow. Timings are important, so always arrive in the time that's stated. Don't arrive half an hour early, because you will not be allowed in, and do not arrive late, because if you're really late, again, you won't be allowed in. Dress codes are important. Traditionally, it will be a white tie, and for ladies, it will be ball gowns or formal wear with tiaras, medals, national dress. So it's very, very formal. As far as the actual rules with the actual state banquet, again, it's when you meet the member of the royal family, you've got to remember your bowing, your curtsying. Handshakes is probably unlikely unless you are the foreign head of state that's with a member of the royal family. And you've got to remember things like when the meal begins, there's the speeches, there's obviously the national anthems, there's then the orchestra will play the music as the meal's getting served. As far as the actual meal goes, you've just got to remember to start on the outside and work your way in. With cutlery, glassware, you're going to start with the toasts. So there'll be the champagne, there'll be white wine, there'll be red wine, there'll be water, there'll be dessert wine, and there'll be ports. So you've got to remember your order of having those. Same with the courses, make sure you go in the right order, and always remember to use your napkin, and remember your napkin etiquette, which for ladies is where you have the crease away from you with the opening towards, gentlemen have it the other way round. And the reason being is that ladies can pick up a corner, they can dab and then place the napkin back down and it conceals any lipstick or crumbs.
I would draw up a security program, submit that to the commissioner. The plan for him would go to Diana, go to the Queen. They would sign it off. We'd print out an operation order. We sort out how we were going to get there, whether we were going to fly commercially or whether we were going to fly by the Queen's flight, and so forth. So something like that. And it was so well planned. And there'd always be a contingency. You'd always have a backup contingency there, of course. But that's how it worked. It sounds simple. They were fairly complicated. A lot of phone calls, a lot of planning. But they normally went very well.
You've also got to remember that if the king stands, then all the guests stand. If the king sits, then all the guests can sit. And as far as the actual enjoying the meal, you should wait until the king begins eating, traditionally. And also, when the king finishes, stops eating, the guests should actually also, well, they should actually have finished. Strictly speaking, the late Prince Philip used to say to other guests about the Queen that once the Queen stops, you've got to make sure that you're finished. So he used to tell everyone to quickly eat up so that they weren't left behind in a jokey, humorous kind of way. But it was quite a serious thing because the plates would get taken away once the Queen stopped eating, and that is a tradition that a king, I believe, will continue.
Most police services throughout the world, you know, serve the same agenda. I mean, but with differing local practices, of course. You know, in Pakistan it was quite difficult because the police were quite brutal in the sense they were quite, they were quite handy with their staves and their sticks. And I remember actually it was in somewhere in Pakistan, it wasn't in Islamabad, but in one town visit, there were literally thousands of people that lined the highways. And there were no barriers because the police didn't have that equipment. And of course, I remember these police officers on sort of Bantam 125 motorcycles, were our escort. And the civil police have these batons and they sort of knock people's legs, you see. And Diana said to me one day, she said, "Ken, can you stop them hitting the people?" I said, "Well, I'll try, but, that's what it's like." And I, said to this guy, I said, "Look, can you stop hitting people?" And he looked at me and said, "Well, hang on, you telling me to do my job, this is how we work it." So nobody complained, anyway, that's how it was. But luckily nothing went wrong, so. But it was a different style of policing, but that happens,
When you're invited to, from my point of view, getting invited to the Gillies dance, I suppose that is in Scotland, that is a royal ball. And when you get invited to a royal ball, obviously dress codes are important. In Scotland it was natural dress, but of course if it's, say, at Buckingham Palace, it's going to be ball gowns and white tie and tiaras. And the actual etiquette is, again, you never got asked a member of the royal family to dance. They have to come and ask you. That's one of the golden rules. And also it's important you know how to dance. Don't go to a royal ball and have no idea how to dance. That's vital to kind of know how to do that. And don't overdrink. That's the other piece of advice I would give you. I've seen people at different royal events where they drink a little bit too much to calm the nerves, and unfortunately they become a little bit intoxicated, or as the Queen Mother say, they've mixed the pills. And so it's quite important not to get to that point for the simple reason of you don't want to get kind of asked to leave. And also if you do get to dance with a member of the royal family, you want to make sure that you know what you're doing. So that's obviously quite important as well. And again, bear in mind that you know who you're speaking to. So it's good doing a bit of research, remembering the titles, the bowing, the cutscene, the handshakes, all the same rules that apply with Wales apply there as well. So that's quite, and conversation etiquette is also important, that stick to the safe subjects, don't ask anything personal and let them lead the conversation.
Every tour was memorable for me, every single one of them. And it's very difficult when people ask me that question to pick one out. I suppose if I had to pick one out, it would be a private journey that Diana made to Verona in Italy. Stayed with friends of her mother and her mother's friend,
We stayed with the Contessa Rizzardi on Lake Garda. And the purpose of the visit was to go and see the great Pavarotti sing in Verdi's Requiem. And I love both popular and classical music, so for me this was a real bonus. And we managed to get out to Lake Garda without anybody knowing, which was surprising. And the night of the concert, the great man himself came out, and then within minutes there was this almighty, I say almighty, thunderstorm. And you know, it was a sort of rain of stair rods and claps of thunder and lightning. It was like the end of the world. And suddenly a steward had came across with this sheet of white tarpaulin, because it was open. It was at the amphitheatre in Verona. So there was the princess, myself, her mother, and a few others all sat underneath this tarpaulin in the hope that the rain would subside and the concert would begin. But it never did. It was probably one of the first times, or second time in the history of these concerts that the concert was cancelled. So what do we do now? Well, Diana said, why don't we go to Venice? And I said, Venice? I don't know where Venice is. I mean, where we were. And I looked at Diana and I looked at my colleagues, the Italian colleagues, and they said something that was clearly not very nice. In any event, we set off. We drove to Venice, and literally 2 hours later, we arrived at this police station by the canal, which was seriously under 2 foot of water. And we were in a Volvo, and we luckily went to a point where we could get out of the car without even stepping into a foot of water. But the police car that had followed us had driven into a submerged wooden stanchion, which made Diana laugh, obviously. And we got out and walked across St. Mark's Square, got into a police launch, and then for the next hour chugged along the Grand Canal, under the Bridge of Sighs, and then came back. And my colleague had managed to commandeer some bread or some croissant, I remember, and probably more important, 2 bottles of Pinot Grigio. And then we were chugging around. There was a sort of some respite in the weather. And then we walked back across St. Mark's Square, got in the car back to Lake Garda, and got back to London. And nobody knew about this. But for me, I mean, that was an incredible journey. Seeing the great Pavarotti, Verona, and then walking around St. Mark's Square and Venice at midnight, you know, with the Princess of Wales, her mother, and friends, and nobody knew who they were, who we were, and when we got back, no pictures or anything in the press. So a bit of a first, really.
So the interesting thing is when you think about etiquette kind of being broken or rules changing, is where you've got the staff and members of the royal family dancing together, which is obviously quite an unusual thing. From my point of view, when I was at Balmoral Castle, this is what I thought was extraordinary, was getting to dance with members of the royal family, because you are there, obviously, as well, from my point of view, as a butler, and suddenly there I am at a ball dancing with members of the royal family, and you feel lucky that you get those opportunities. In fact, for me, there was many times when I was off duty and I'd get invited to things, lunches, receptions, events, obviously the balls, even at Buckingham Palace, balls at Buckingham Palace. And it was always really something to be asked to go. But obviously it was strange because suddenly you're a staff member, but you're there as a guest.
Well, when Diana died in Paris in 1997, I was renovating an older property in Dorset. And at about 1 o'clock in the morning, this pager danced across the wooden floorboards where I was sleeping. And it actually said, you know, ring my office urgently. And I thought, go on, you know, what's happening here? So I literally had to walk up to the phone box in the village because I didn't have a phone. The immediate reaction was, well, it's impossible. You know, if you can't die in a car crash, you know, no, I just couldn't believe it. He said, well, you have to believe it. Anyway, I went back to London.
King Charles is a fun, down to earth, kind, compassionate person, and as a king, he'll be all those things. I think he's kind, he's caring, compassionate. He always wants to do things the right way, and he wants to make sure that he's getting it right. And that'll be the same with this job as king. He'll want to make sure he gets it right. He won't want to make any mistakes or any errors or say or do the wrong things. So he'll do everything to make sure that, because you kind of get one chance, don't you? In this job, you, as a king or a queen, you don't really get much room for mistakes, and the Queen famously never made a mistake. So I think that would be the king's goal, is to make sure that he doesn't make any mistakes, and I don't think he will. And he'll be doing everything to make sure that he gets it right, that he gets it spot on.
Deep down, I then reflected upon that conversation I had with her at Kensington Palace about the protection, because, you know, I knew at that moment that the reason she died was because of a failure in her protection. And this moves on to perhaps a very big issue with me. I have been very critical publicly about the protection of her when with Dodi Fayed and under the so-called protection of Mohammed Al Fayed, because I feel quite strongly about it. And I have been critical of the bodyguards Rhys Jones and Wingfield, and I've never spoken to them. I'm only critical of what happened and what I see as failures of their protection. As difficult as it was for them, I acknowledge that totally. And it would have been difficult, given that Wingfield and Rhys Jones, you know, had never given protection to somebody such as high profile as Diana before. They, as serving officers in the military in their previous life, were no doubt very good at the protection they were giving when employed as such. But giving protection to somebody in a civilian environment is a totally different ball game. Well, when I left Diana, I sort of worked for a year in organising and coordinating inbound visits by foreign royal members of the royal family. So, you know, families from Europe, Swedish, Denmark, even Tokyo, the Japanese royal family. So for a year, that was quite interesting. And then I was in charge of the close protection at royalty protection based at Buckingham Palace. I was instructor for a short while on the National Bodyguard course. And my latter post was working for the Queen's cousin, the Duke of Kent, which I worked with him for just under 3 years, which was a real privileged posting. Extraordinary man, absolute sort of loyal to Her Majesty the Queen, and a totally different sort of protection. And I always remember that the first engagement I ever did with him was, I think it was the Queen's Golden Jubilee. And I met him at Kensington Palace. And I waited by the door and he came out. He said, "I don't know why you're here." I said, "Sorry, sir?" He said, "I don't know why you're here." He said, "Nobody knows who I am." He said, "But they know who you are though, don't you?" And it was rather in a funny way, but working with him without the crowds, without the people, was something that I did actually really enjoy.
I think the death of the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, and the proclamation of a new king, King Charles III, it hasn't changed the nation. I mean, it's going to be different because it's no longer a queen, it's now a king, but I think that I don't see the nation as such changing. I mean, it is different and it's a different era now. You know, the second Elizabethan era is now over. So it is a, you know, but with all things, you know, nothing stays the same, unfortunately. Nothing stays the same, and, you know, we'll all get used to it, and I think it'll be a long time, a long time before we get used to the fact of the Queen not being around. So I think there's always part of us that are going to remember or think about the Queen, or do you remember when the Queen did this, or when the Queen went there, and thanks to social media and online media, there's always going to be memories of the Queen for a long, long time.
No, since leaving a long time ago now, you know, one never expected to get invited back. It doesn't happen anyway, and by the very fact that I chose to write a memoir in 2002, I'm sure I was sort of removed from their Christmas card list immediately, which was not unexpected. I did see Diana once or twice when I was still working, and almost about a year after I'd left, funny enough, I was returning from the Belgian embassy in Belgrave Square. It was when I was working with overseas royalty, and I remember walking back through a mews, and this black Audi stopped, and I didn't know it was Diana driving the car, and she said, "Ken, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, funny enough," I said, "more importantly, what are you doing here?" And she just smiled on her face. She said, "Well, look behind me." And there were two paparazzi guys with their tripods and so forth. And I said, "Well, nothing changes then, does it?" She said, "No." I said, "How are you feeling with it?" She said, "Well, it's annoying." I said, "Yeah." I said, "We've been down this road, haven't we?" I said, "Look, just be careful." And she drove off. And that was the last time I saw her. And I bumped into Harry once in Green Park with his dog, and he said hello, and you know, typical Harry thing. But that was it really, and life really moves on. I've written a lot, said a lot, continue to say a lot, but my abiding memory of working for the royal family was a very positive one. I enjoyed it. I was indeed very privileged. I'm not critical. I think working with the royal family, certainly working with the Prince and Princess of Wales, that you are sort of dropped into this royal box of magic, and you know, you wander around it, and you actually start to see how all these tricks work. Some of them are good tricks, some of them are not so good tricks, but I'm still a believer in it. I think that whatever format the monarchy takes into the 21st century, I think there is a new monarchy around the corner, and it will be William's generation and Harry's generation that will decide its fate. You know, what format will it take? I think it'll be interesting. Yeah, there are loads of memories and anecdotes. I mean, working with them, I mean, it was incredible. I mean, and they were funny. You know, kids are funny generally. Children of that age, 5 up to 10, 12, tend to generate a sense of humour, or generate a style of humour that, you know, if you're prepared to stand back and watch it, but which of course I had to. One of the best stories for me, with William particularly, who was actually much more reserved than Harry. Harry was the sort of the frontline jester that will be the guy that would be entertaining. And also, if you ever got in a spot of bother, you know, if Harry were old enough, he's the sort of guy that would come and help you out. William would think about it. But, you know, that's not a criticism of either. I was very fortunate to go with Diana to Richard Branson's island, Necker Island, in the British Virgin Islands, on 2 occasions. I mean, what a privilege for me, I mean, to see that part of the world. The manager from the island, Branson's Island, had just returned from neighbouring Tortola with the supplies. And in these supplies, he said, he was Canadian, he said, "I've got some gifts for the children." I said, "Oh, what's that?" He said, "I've got a couple of catapults." And I thought he meant these handheld catapults. I thought, no, we don't want those. It's the last thing we want. No, but these were these massive, great elastic catapults, you know, sort of inch square elastic with these huge pouches that you tie to 2 trees. And they had this sort of bag of balloons that you fill with water. And then and I thought, oh, maybe great for the kids. They can sort of have, you know, sort of target competitions. William heard all this, and he came up to me. He said, "Ken," he said, "I've got a very good idea." I said,
what's that? He said, well, when Mummy has to give a press opportunity, Harry and me and my cousins, we can be on the cliff top and we can fire the balloons at the press. I said, you better go and speak to your mother about this. Anyway, Diana came back almost immediately. She said, and a completely different frame of mind, she said, Ken, I think it's a very good idea. So I said, so you're going to do this press thing? Yes, why not? And then suddenly, from the top of this cliff, came the words, fire. So off the top of this came this sort of salvo of multicolored water-filled balloons that landed right in the center of this flotilla of cameramen who interestingly found it incredibly amusing.
I think the damage that's been done to the relationship through the different media interviews, the book, I really don't know if that's fixable, because so the thing about the royal family is the biggest thing to them is trust. That's the be all and end all is trust. And once you've lost that, it's gone. And I think that will have been lost. I think that will have gone. However, Harry is still the king's son. He's only got 2 boys. I know the king loves and adores both boys equally. I witnessed that a lot on many occasions, so I know how much that love is. Just that the Queen loved him as well. And I don't think anything could change that. I really don't. I really believe that that kind of love cannot be destroyed. But from the public point of view, there is the embarrassment part and the awkwardness of that. And I think that part, a door will be closed on that part. But behind the scenes, as far as the love between a father and son, I don't know. I'd like to think that one day that's fixable. One day they can fix that. Even though the relationship in the public might never be the same again, it'd be nice to think that one day behind closed doors they can heal that part of the relationship, which I think is possible, I think.
It's a very technical generation. I mean, William and Harry speak in a totally different way, and so different than when I was serving. Even the Queen appears to have modulated her tone of voice, and it's moving in a new direction. Well, all these other palaces that are, strewn around the United Kingdom, Balmoral, or Sandringham, Windsor Castle, I think, they could be all places of hospitality for the government. So I think there are changes afoot that will see the monarchy move in a new direction. But I firmly believe that the programme of modernisation, and there'll be those that disagree with me, that began really during the sort of very short Diana period from 1981 to 1993, 94 when she abandoned, but right up until her death in 97, because even as a non-working member of the royal in the latter stages of her life, she'll always be remembered for her work and her programme of modernisation, this sort of getting in touch with people, and her programme against government advice of getting involved in the lands mines crusade in Angola and Mozambique. I think, that was very important for people to remember that. And I think that's why people to this day still remember and talk about Diana, because of the way that she began a change at the beginning of how we perceive the royal family to be. And I think in her 2 sons, certainly William, more so now than Harry because of his situation, sees a direction very much akin to that of his mother.
and her family. And I liked the idea of being part of this. And I said to my late father, how do you become part of that? How do you join the royal family?
I'm formerly the protection officer bodyguard to the late Diana, Princess of Wales.
They knew that I could do the part of a butler, but I just had to learn. She would give you a very gentle nudge backwards to say that your time is up. Etiquette kind of been broken or rules changing is where you've got the staff and members of the royal family.
Well, when Diana died in Paris in 1997, I